I'd like to welcome everyone to this workshop. I'd like to introduce Grissom Walker, who is our moderator today, and he's going to introduce the rest of the panel. He is a native of Sarasota and an attorney here. He's been active with the ACLU since serving as chapter chair at FSU College of Law, and currently serves on the Florida ACLU Board of Directors as representative of the Sarah Manatee chapter. So take it away.
Howdy. This is Fighting for Democracy. And for those of you who were at Reverend Meyer's part of the presentation, he had his wonderful schedule of 4 types of democracy, and you could almost make the mistake of thinking we were fighting for democracy 4.0. But as at least some of the panel discussions here are going to point out, we're still struggling to get to 2.0, which was the indirect representative parliamentary democracy, because we've got issues regarding getting people the right to vote. We've got other basic issues before we can get, or at least before we can wholly focus on some of the direct participatory levels. So we've got some structural stuff going on as well. We have a panel of 3 people who come from different perspectives on this. So we've got Gina Duncan. She's with Equality Florida. I think we all know that folks with non-traditional sexual orientations and choices or statuses have had great difficulty entering the political mainstream. For the longest time, if someone was not a, what is it?
Cisgendered white man.
Cisgendered white man, okay. Participation was just unavailable.
Nailed it.
Then you could be a cisgender female, sort of, but it was still considered a novelty. And if you had any sort of other status, participation was not an option. We now have, in Florida, did you say 3 elected?
Over the years, yes.
Yeah, but it is still very much a difficulty for basic political participation. We have George, who I think everybody who was here at the speech, I could say she literally needs no further introduction. But she has been involved in a lifetime of various struggles. Her current affiliation is with Move to Amend. And the big issue there is corporate personhood, which is why you may have heard her refer to a particular Supreme Court case. She later, I think, threw it even further back in history, but there's a reason Santa Fe versus Pacific stands there, because that's where they reified the person status of businesses, corporations, as a way of implementing the 14th Amendment, because of course we know that's what we fought the Civil War for.
That's Santa Clara, not Santa Fe.
I'm sorry, Santa Clara. Yeah, that's another railroad, my bad.
Santa Clara?
Yeah.
Santa Clara
Versus the Pacific Railroad.
Yeah, there was a railroad involved,
Okay,
but it was
very
not
good.
the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe.
No.
My bad.
And
that
that's
was
old enough, it's released.
48.
That was just, was it before the 14th? I thought it was an implementation of the 14th.
Yes, it was. I'm pretty sure it was 1848,
Well,
and they.
way back machine.
No, George.
Had to be,
I
had
could be wrong. I said I'd be
1868.
sure.
to be 68 because they didn't get the amendment in until after the war.
Okay.
And we have Kirk Bailey. Kirk is the political director of the ACLU of Florida. He is a lawyer, but he's not a courtroom sort of lawyer. He is working the halls of power and advocacy. And that is not necessarily a complete novelty for the ACLU, but it is something of a novelty to actually have a dedicated point person for it, who on the organizational chart is right up there with the legal director handling cases. So, and the ACLU's most obvious and direct movement on fighting for democracy has to do with the fact that we have 1.6, 1.5, 1.7. It worries me that the number keeps seeming to change. A million disenfranchised Floridians because they have a felony conviction. This also, somewhat like that Supreme Court state, dates back to the Florida Constitution that came into effect shortly after the Civil War, but it has nothing to do with any of the racial dynamics since then. I know that because the 11th Circuit tells me so. There was an attempt to solve this through litigation by indicating that the amendment was part of a package of procedures introduced throughout the South to suppress the black vote in the wake of the Civil War. the 11th Circuit says no. Some of that has to do with poor record keeping in the early days of the Florida state government. Some of it has to do with a constitutional revision in 1968, because of course we know that by 1968, any vestiges of racial animus had obviously left Florida politics. But, as I said, the 11th Circuit tells me, and as a lawyer, I believe. But fighting for democracy can mean a lot of different things. In our program, there was a add-on sheet that talked about publicly owned broadband and democracy platforms to increase citizen participation that included reference to Barcelona. I will tell you that when I was preparing for this, until I saw this, I hadn't really thought about that. But yes, education, in order to create a well-informed and participatory group of people, can be regarded as fighting for democracy, fighting for public schools, fighting for quality schools. Aside from the fact that whenever we do the standard free speech argument, we're talking in terms of the ability to have that public debate where people have that discussion, and that is part of the value of why free speech is a bedrock for a democracy. But as I said, currently for the ACLU, their focus is on a rather more particular one, and that is getting people the right to actually vote. And so each of these panelists is going to come at this from a different direction. Some of this is intensely local stuff. And I may be wrong here, but I think at this point, if we're going to talk about participatory type processes, that is likely to be, at least in this stage in the proceedings, something more of a local initiative, where you're going to have a local community, people that know each other face to face. I'm not going to say that participatory democracy at a national level for the United States is not in the cards. I don't think that's where that action is. But the action on some of the more structural matters, getting people the right to participate, and even getting people to feel like they want to participate. Many of you are aware we have a local state representative race, District 72. It is an off election, a by-election. There will be an incredibly small turnout if historical trends show. Now, that might actually be good for one of these candidates. They might have a better chance of unseating an unknown son of power than an incumbent in a large election where people are coming to vote for their party regardless. But Sarasota also has another campaign going, and that's a campaign for single-member districts on our county commission. Historically, single-member districts have tended to allow for greater participation by minorities that are able to achieve a majority in a particular district, whereas if you have countywide voting, they may likely never have that opportunity. And if you have the sort of housing patterns that Sarasota certainly has, you can also end up with the opposite problem, which is to say that so many people of a particular minority are crammed into just one district that you bleach the other district. So one can have a question as to whether in a particular geographic situation or given a particular political history, is that, is single-member district always the better democratic choice? Or are sometimes there occasions where it doesn't? So some of these are not simple questions. I've said enough. Let's kick it off. Do I have a participant who's ready to start?
Yeah, I'm right next
All
to you.
right.
I'll go. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Gina Duncan, and I'm the Director of Transgender Equality at Equality Florida. I am a transgender woman. I transitioned 10 years ago at 50 years old from male to female. In my role at Equality Florida, I do a great deal of public policy work as well as education work and local advocacy. And all of that definitely relates to growing democracy and making sure that everyone has their rights to be represented, their identities to be represented at the state and national level, and that certainly everyone is educated in reference to providing a platform where everyone is treated equally under the law. In our work at Equality Florida, you might know that we are the state's largest LGBT advocacy organization. We have over 300,000 members. We would encourage you, if you haven't joined, to go to eqfl.org and join. We're doing some really good things across the state in reference to social justice and political policy. from advocacy work at a grassroots level all the way through the state level to educating major employers, the media, law enforcement, healthcare organizations in reference to inclusive and welcoming non-discrimination policies towards LGBTQ people. School boards. We do a great deal of work with school boards in reference to LGBTQ cultural competency and making sure all of our students, especially in K through 12, are treated equally and with respect and by damn are able to use the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity. You know, it all boils down to the bathroom issue. But in working with major employers, we found that there's a common denominator in the fact that major employers in Florida, much as we saw in North Carolina, believe in a welcoming and inclusive workplace. They believe that that not only gives them a economic advantage, but it also enables them to recruit the best and the brightest and retain people. Because people, especially millennials coming out of college, want to work for companies that are welcoming and inclusive. What we found where the connection is with public policy is we have over 250 major employers who now support us at the state level in getting a state non-discrimination law passed. Many people don't know that while we have 42 fully inclusive human rights ordinances across the state in cities and counties, which say that people cannot be discriminated against in public accommodations, housing, or employment based on sexual orientation or gender identity, it's a patchwork. So like I can get in my car in Orlando, Florida that has human rights ordinances and say travel to Pensacola and get out of my car in Pensacola with less rights and protections than when I got in. Many people don't know in the state of Florida that you can get married. It's now legally to marry your same-sex partner in the state of Florida and in the country. Yet in the state of Florida, you can go to work and put that beautiful picture of your marriage from Saturday on your desk and still be fired for being gay or be fired for being trans. We don't have a state non-discrimination law. We introduced what's called the Competitive Workforce Act in 2010 to finally pass a statewide non-discrimination law that would treat everyone equally under the law in the state of Florida, where they couldn't be fired based on those parameters of simply who you love or who you are. We've been working on getting that passed since 2010. So what that means to our democratic processes and pushing for progressive candidates is just that. You can see the connection in the fact that we look for grassroots. My adage is when they go low, we go local. Borrowed one from Michelle there, not sure she won't mind. But it really speaks to what we're doing here today and how this elevates to the state level. That we elect people in our cities, in our counties, in our school boards. And then that pushes up to our representatives and our senators. And we have more and more LGBTQ people being elected in our state legislatures. And then from there, we're also seeing this younger generational element coming into Tallahassee and saying, y'all are fighting over bathrooms? Our younger generation, the millennials don't even understand what that's all about. So our work is definitely, has intersectionality with growing a social justice platform so that democracy can be enjoyed by all.
Cool.
That's my introductory statement, and I'm sticking to it.
Sounds good. My turn.
George Fred, yes, please.
Introductory statement. Thanks for framing that. Now I can think about what I'm supposed to say. I'm George. I'm happy to be here. North Carolina native, serious Southerner, and a founder with Move to Amend. So Move to Amend exists because we do not currently have a functioning democracy. We have, some people can call it an oligarchy, but we have a situation where the wealthiest people are making the decisions that guide our policy in this country. When it comes to healthcare, when it comes to economic policy, when it comes to environmental policy, when it comes to foreign policy. It boils down to how can we make that money? And not how we, because I ain't make no money, the people at the top are making that money. And we didn't start because we were concerned about runaway profits among the top 1%. When we came together to have moved to amend, what drove us was having a functioning democracy. Y'all probably know that when the Constitution was written and ratified in 1789, it was relevant to 5% of the humans that lived in this country in 1789. I have no idea what percent of the people now it's relevant to. Maybe 3, maybe 2, certainly not 99%, certainly not 100%, and certainly not me. So my passion for being part of Move to Amend is because I believe deeply in the aspirations of this country. We have lots of aspirations, none of which we've realized. So there's a way that you could see all of those as lies, lies, and more lies. And that would be accurate. But I think of it more as aspirations and something that we can reach together. I think that we, the people, are sacred words, and that we, the people, should be running this government. And now we're not. One thing that is really troubling about the reality now of corporations running us is that we, the people, can work for, fight for, and win a political win. Like you were talking about a political win. In North Carolina, a big political win is being able to go after corporations that are polluting people because of their farming practices, especially if they have caged animals. So we could get that win, and you know what happens? That corporation, that business can go into court and overturn that win because it violates their constitutional rights. Because as long as they have constitutional rights. In North Carolina, there's a group of about 100 people, or 100 families. Duplin County, North Carolina. They live near hog farms. They wanted to sue the business to do better management of the waste, which is possible. It is possible for them to manage the waste in a way that's not as egregious as it currently is. The state legislature overturned them and said you cannot sue them. Forbid these 100 families, mostly black people, from suing these corporations. So that's my biggest, well, biggest is a strong word, but it's a chief concern about our current lack of democracy. We're 2 years, Move to Amend is 2 years in to a 10-year plan to amend the Constitution. So we have a 28th Amendment making it clear that money is not political speech and corporations do not have constitutional rights. That gives us at least a level playing field is, I don't know if that's right, but at least it brings us to a place where now we can talk about a real democracy, maybe about a constitution that is meaningful for more than 5% of the people that live here. My introduction.
The risk of following such great speakers, of course, is that you won't have much to add that's very meaningful. So I'll do my best, but I just want to acknowledge the comments of my colleagues here. So my name's Kirk Bailey. I'm the political director for the ACLU of Florida. I've been committing politics for about 30 years in a variety of different states around the nation. I'm originally from the Northwest and Alaska and Oregon, where I started my political and legislative career. I spent probably a decade in Washington, D.C. as a lobbyist. By training, I'm a lawyer, but by avocation, I'm a lobbyist, which in most crowds makes me an L short of a 3-time loser. Not this crowd, I can tell. But then I came to Florida largely because of family. My wife is originally from here, and so brought what skill I had gained elsewhere to the fight that we have here in Florida. And am humbled, frankly, to be able to be in a position to do that because of what's at stake in Florida's democracy. Grissom already talked about the 1.68 million Floridians who are disenfranchised from their vote because of their criminal backgrounds. The single largest number in the United States, and it's a travesty against what we would believe are the aspirations that George referred to for our democracy. That those people who have fulfilled their sentences, who have committed their crime but done their time,
That's right.
have paid back to society what they owed, both in time and money, that they would then not be allowed to enjoy the benefit to privilege the right to be able to participate in our democracy is just a crime. It's a crime against nature, it's a crime against humanity. And so we're dedicated to fighting that fight along with a large coalition of folks across the state. The Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, our friends at Equality Florida, many other organizations, the League of Women Voters. I could go on and on and on, but they'll all be organizations that are familiar to you in terms of that effort. So, that effort's been going on for quite some time, well before I ever got involved. As you know, the amendment was certified by the Supreme Court to go on the ballot last spring. Since then, we've been gathering petitions to actually get it onto the ballot. The deadline for having those petitions gathered and certified by the state is February 1st. We have to have 766,000 petitions to qualify. In order
How many
to
do we
get,
have?
I'm building up.
Okay.
In order to get to that number, we have to have approximately 1.1 million signatures total, because some of them are verified and some of them aren't. Some of them are good and some of them aren't. We currently have 750,000 unverified petitions. We have 300,000 verified petitions. So the answer to the question is, we're a little over halfway, with about 2 months to go. And I can tell you right now that if we maintain the pace that we're on, in other words, if you all keep doing what you've been doing, in terms of getting your friends and neighbors and colleagues to sign those petitions, we'll make it right around Christmas.
Cool.
But only if we keep up doing what we're doing. And I want to sort of pivot to what Grissom said earlier about, and I think everybody has said about local. This campaign isn't about like what's happening at the state. It's about how many signatures we get at the local level, about how many each and every one of you can get, each and every one of our family members can get. This has been a grassroots and volunteer effort from day one. And regardless of the alphabet soup of names that I cited earlier in terms of people who've engaged, the real heroes of this story at the end of the day will be all of you and your family and friends in every community around Florida who beat the streets at every festival, at every event you possibly could, at places like this one to get that petition signed. I like to tell people, I begin campaigns, which is what we're in, with a vision of what election day is going to look like. And so in my head, I have a party planned. We're going to go to election night, right? And we're going to get the results probably about 11 p.m. And we're either going to be drinking for one of two reasons. One way or the other. So I want that champagne popping everywhere. And I want it to be champagne popping everywhere for a gentleman named Desmond Meade, who is the chairman of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. May be familiar to many of you. But Desmond has a great personal story, formerly incarcerated. I think it was a drug bust. Did his time, came out, got his degrees, got his law degree. In every way is like the best example of what we want our citizens to be, can't vote. And for him and every person like him, I want to have a big champagne party on election night in 2018. And I'm sure all of you do as well.
That's awesome.
So that's our goal here in Florida. I want to say a little bit about the ACLU more generally. Our campaign here on this particular voting rights issue is part of a larger national campaign that we launched earlier this month called Let People Vote. And that campaign is a national 50-state campaign that is focused on voting rights issues in all of the states. It takes a different form in each state. So in Georgia, it's an independent election districting commission. In Ohio, it's reforms to how they do their voter registration and same-day registration policies. In Florida, it takes the form of this particular ballot measure. But we're using our people power mobilization network to be able to try to drive these campaigns on all 50 states as an antidote, if you will, to the COBAC so-called Election Integrity Commission. I don't think it's not news to anybody here. We fight on these issues every day. We sue a lot. We win a lot. We lose some here every once in a while. But we're trying to be more political in the fight, in taking the fight to COBAC, this administration, his commission on voting rights, to expand the franchise for all citizens across the United States, because it has implications for local participatory democracy as well as our national participatory democracy. So I want you to understand that our campaign in Florida is in the context of a national effort. At the end of the day, though, I return to what I said earlier. It's all about us and our local communities getting out, being in the streets, meeting the candidates, getting petitions signed. If we can't do it there, we can't expect change at the national level. And I'll stop there and happy to have a discussion.
I am taking the path of least resistance as moderator and going to solicit questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
I'm a proponent of a couple things. One, anticipating, and the other one is stopping the bleeding. In the area of stopping the bleeding, I still don't understand, I've asked this of every ACLU person I've seen, why when the usage of drugs among whites and blacks is roughly equal, and yet it's demonstrable that there's like a 4 or 5 times ratio of convictions on blacks versus the rest of the population and Hispanics, that the ACLU cannot do something to try to go after that inequality and correct it. The second thing, in terms of anticipation, is we are going to have a large inflow of Democratic voters coming in from Puerto Rico. It's my belief that somebody at the state level will try to do something to block their ability to vote in the state or put in special ruling. Is there anything we can do to anticipate that and get ahead of them and keep this from happening?
So I heard 2 questions in there, and I would invite the group, if you have information or comments, to join me in this. But let me see if I can take a run at both of them. And I should mention that I have a colleague in the room that I may call in to help me. Michelle Morton in the back there. Raise your hand, Michelle.
I was like, surely you won't throw me under the bus.
I'm not going to throw Michelle under the bus.
He's
but
raising you up.
I want to raise up Michelle because she's a member of the community here in Sarasota, a former staff director at the Florida State Legislature. She does work for us as a policy coordinator on juvenile justice issues and assists our work in the criminal justice reform area. And I heard the first question to be a little bit about what are we doing about dealing with how the criminal justice system addresses these crimes and inappropriate or sort of unequal treatment between African Americans and Caucasians and white folk.
It's really comforting to know the ACLU has got this covered. I just want to say.
Okay, so I guess the answer is I would want to take your question back, frankly, and consult with our legal team a little bit, because I'm not sure what our legal grounds would be in terms of pursuing a litigative option, to be honest with you. And
Well, injured parties, that's for sure.
Certainly, and there may be some cases that they've worked on that have failed, or we haven't discovered the right theories that we would pursue that would be successful. I can tell you that on the public policy front, the other main campaign that we're working on is a criminal justice reform campaign. And in that campaign, we've talked a lot about the disparate treatment of the African American community by our criminal justice system when it comes to drugs and lots of other crimes. And so we're trying to put together legislative reforms that would get to those issues and reduce the incarceration rate, reduce the racial inequalities within the criminal justice system, and frankly pursue both of those goals at the same time. So a good example is we've got some proposals around departing from mandatory and minimum sentences, particularly in drug cases, and trying to authorize our judges to be able to use their discretion in a more appropriate way to depart from those required mandatory and minimum sentences. We have legislation that's going to be introduced on that this session. This particular step that we're looking at is a sort of an initial step in trying to have a more general reform of mandatory minimum sentencing within the state. We're looking at a 3 to 5 year horizon for some of these criminal justice reforms to try to get at exactly the issues that you're describing. But I feel like that answer is probably not sufficient to, I think, what you're talking about, which may also involve some litigative options. So let me put a pin in that and sort of take it back.
Well, I can add a
And
little bit.
Michelle, yeah,
Jump
please
in
add.
and add a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
bit. And along these same lines, I think that, and I recognize my privilege and know that I don't know the other side of this. It seems like there are definitely policies in place, and of course my angle is from the kids and juveniles, from the school level on up that are disproportionately affecting especially Black children. And this is local too. In Sarasota, I just happen to have this, that Black students are 4.5 times as likely to be suspended as white students and 7 times as likely to be expelled. Once that happens, once you're expelled, suspended, pushed out of the school, you're more likely to be arrested. All these things are connected, and so that it's such a huge problem, and it would be nice if it would just take one lawsuit. But I think it's gonna take a lot more work on the ground, policy changes, cultural changes to get people to recognize that it's not just this family having an issue, that it's all of us. So that's my.
Can I add something there?
Absolutely.
I'm not a lawyer at all. But I do know a little bit about the school prison pipeline. And as you pointed out, Michelle, you get an in-school suspension, then an out-of-school suspension, then you're expelled, and then you're arrested within X number of months of that, especially if you're Black or brown. But one other issue is you have police officers with weapons, armed police officers, in the blessed schools.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, that's something locally you can do something about, because you can work together to get those officers out of the school. Yes, bullying is a problem in schools, and yes, there's a need to be safe at school, but there are ways to create that. You can deal with bullying programs, you can teach young people how to communicate with each other without violence, and create safe schools. You do not need an armed police officer with a school, because that makes your school an occupied space. And for some folks, your community is an occupied space. If you're Black or brown, every weekend there's going to be a checkpoint outside your trailer park or your neighborhood, going through people's cars and looking to see who's documented or not, or looking to see who's got a roach in the back of the car and arrest the whole car. Craziness, y'all. So pushing to get officers out of schools, pushing to decriminalize schools, to decriminalize education, so that you're not creating that school to prison pipeline, or you're interrupting it, and providing options for students to really create, and I don't live in Florida, so I can't recommend what y'all do locally, but consider if schools become community resources. Imagine if at your school, if you live in a low-income neighborhood, your school is a place, while you're at work, your kid can stay there till you come home. And they can work on their homework, or they can create plays together, or do music or whatever together. It's also a place where you can go as a low-income person for health checks or mental health check. If you need therapy, it's available at the school. There's all kinds of options to make schools resources for communities, which is a tool of democracy if we have relationships with each other, if we're educated, if we can have access to people with more resources than we have, whether that's a laptop or internet, or even skills that we can learn. Cooking classes for low-income folks, so that oh yes, beans and rice, I don't need to eat, dead cow every meal. There really are ways creatively for us to think about how do we make our communities and our neighborhoods work for the people living there? How do we make less risk for people who are at risk and create more opportunities, create more access, create more options, so that people are able to have self-determination and be able to visualize and then reach their own potential, which we're taking away from young people these days, and we deserve to give it back.
And
That's not that much
does
about
anybody have anything to
Disney.
offer on preparing for challenges to Puerto Ricans?
Yeah, let me take a run at that if I might.
Briefly.
We have been watching the sort of news reports and the numbers around the influx of Puerto Ricans, and I know there are organizations out there who are looking at the registration and what they're going to do about that. We are a nonpartisan organization, so we don't do voter registration. But for those of you who do, or for friends of yours who do, I encourage you to bring as many people into the system as possible. One thing we have talked about internally, though, at the ACLU of Florida is whether or not there will be challenges by the state, or, for lack of a better word, nefarious action by the state to somehow suppress the registration or diminish their opportunities to be able to go to the polls when we get to election day. And so we've been actively talking about how we're going to monitor that and whether or not we'll sue if necessary. The short answer is we'll watch it, and if we see anything, we will definitely sue.
And Indivisible?
Yeah, hi, more question to you, because it's again the voting restoration amendment that I'm concerned with. I think I'm pretty confident just from seeing how people sign it. We do tables all the time and always have the petition on the table, that it will qualify. My concern is, what does the campaign to pass it, which I believe has to have 60%?
That's correct.
What does that campaign look like? Specifically, my concern is that there are very few people who come to this table, who don't come to our table, who we talk to, who don't categorize the petition as something regarding people of color. And I'm, just as worried as when people, we learned after the election that a lot of, shall we say, the Fox News audience regarded Obamacare as something that only black people got.
Okay.
That we're going to have something like that.
Any thoughts on it being perceived as a niche issue or one particular partisan issue as opposed to a plain out civil rights, human rights issue?
Yeah, we've run into this comment, and I think in some circles objection that it really is only to the benefit of black and brown folks in the state, and that's certainly not true. It is true, but it's not the whole truth. The fact of the matter is the disenfranchised population split out equally between white and black, or black and brown, if you will. By proportion of population, of course, the African American community is far overrepresented. But the population of people who would have the opportunity to register and vote is roughly split. So what I would say is that in our polling, that actually doesn't show up as significant of an issue as you might imagine. Now, in anecdotal stories, we hear it quite a bit, but when we polled generally back in the spring, and that just didn't bear out as this sort of notion that it was only for the benefit of the African American community, or that it was only for the partisan benefit of Democrats. Like, most people didn't actually think that that was the purpose of it. But we had to be balanced in our messaging about that, and to say this is about second chances. This is about redemption for these people and their reintegration back into society, and their opportunity to have all the benefits of citizenship that all the rest of us enjoy. And when we did that, it tended to be pretty successful. In the polling we did in the spring, it was north of 60%, and that's what led the campaign to pursue going in 2018. The thing I will say is it's going to be important that we reiterate that message throughout 2018. Once we get done with petitions, the campaign has a campaign manager they're bringing on staff right now, mostly in communications, and what they'll be building is a public education program that will launch in the early part of next year and go through the whole spring and summer to pull out these issues and get people thinking in the right direction.
And Gina, Equality Florida has had efforts where people would say that's not my issue. Do you have any insight on how it is you go about getting people who don't feel that I'm personally affected to vote the right way so that these things can actually pass, human rights ordinances?
Oh, absolutely. We have so many concerns in reference to voting issues, and actually the intersectionality of the work that ACLU is doing and other equal right organizations. One of our biggest concerns is religious exemption, laws, and RFRA, state policies and things like that being passed. And we've seen the policies that the Department of Justice has recently been pushing in reference to, saying it's okay for, people to discriminate against certain identities and parts of our population simply, based on their religious beliefs. We're fortunate in the fact that so far we've seen that there's been a solid pushback against that position. But we do find that thought process, that marginalization of certain communities. And, I think we're going to see this in St. Pete come Tuesday. in that, Kreisman will not be winning the mayoral election in St. Pete without the LGBTQ community in St. Pete, who is solidly behind Rick Kreisman because of his positions on social justice issues, etc. So there's 10% of our population, in some cities larger than that. We see that what goes on at a national level, such as transgender ban for military personnel, to these religious exemption laws that they're trying to put out there that makes it basically, okay for you to discriminate against someone in, baking them a cake or whatever, just based on your religious belief, does filter up, well, locally, but also filters up to a national level in reference to, does our community, for example, the LGBTQ community, which represents, again, roughly 10% of the population, do we feel we have a seat at the table, along with people of color, along with Latinos, along with, all of the identities and communities within our culture to represent themselves? I know within our transgender community, it's kind of an interesting dynamic because right now I'm going around the state doing workshops on voters' rights for transgender people. Because you can think that, and honestly, it's not too difficult to vote if you're transgender, but many people feel like they can't vote if they haven't changed all of their identity documents and they've changed their gender marker on their driver's license and things like that. And it's not true, but that education is part of, we need to get the word out so that LGBT and trans people and gender non-conforming people don't feel like that they are shut out of the process simply because they haven't, caught up on those legal docs and things like that.
Question was from over here. Okay, Reverend?
I just wanted to go back to some of the criminal justice stuff and what we've heard, ACLU and criminal justice campaign. In the state of Florida, punishment is written into law as the justification for the criminal justice system. And as you were talking, Kurt, you were really working out that framework. And we now know that punishment as a political moral philosophy is magical thinking, that most criminal activity or so-called criminal activity arises out of people in traumatized situations. And hitting somebody hard who's already been hit doesn't change their behavior, it just makes them angry and enraged. So we have a tremendous recidivism problem, right? And so we're spending more money on prisons than we are universities. And part of the criminal justice campaign is to try to affect that. We have broad bipartisan support because they want to affect the economics of it. But at the end of the day, we need a movement to change the definition of why we need a justice system. And we need a justice system for rehabilitation, restorative, and reparative reasons, not for punishment. And so the work that I'm trying to do through the churches is get the churches to move away from punishment and to cry out for restoration. And I was just wondering, how does that framework, how is that working into the campaign itself? Are we moving from just specific policy recommendations to actually trying to talk about what the vision, the why of justice? How do we do that?
Well, Reverend, first of all, thank you for the question and thank you for all the work you're doing with us and all the work that you've done on these issues over the years. I think the short answer is I personally, and I think as an institution, we agree with your analysis of the basic, dichotomy there, and want to move the system from punitive to, rehabilitative and restorative. As you know, and as many of us probably know, that's it's just a hard road to hoe. It's getting people to go from an eye for an eye to a hand up or, help and let's work together and let's build a community is kind of difficult to pitch in Tallahassee with, just sort of the nature of how things work up there. But it's definitely at the heart of what we're trying to do. And I think it's the bias that certainly everybody at the ACLU that I've worked with and everybody in the coalition that I've worked with brings to the argument. And it's certainly part of every policy proposal that we're going to present is going to have some technical aspects about why in sentencing or whatever it's the right thing to do. But our talking points are going to talk about the philosophy and the need to move to a more rehabilitative system. I want to say one personal story, if I may. I know I'm taking up a lot of time, and I really shouldn't, but I want to share with everybody this, because it's about my bias. I started as an academic lobbyist working for universities, and when I first went to DC, I worked for an institute that did work on youth violence. And this was right about the time the school shootings were happening. A lot of, like, Springfield and then Columbine happened. And people would ask us, well, why can't we predict this? Well, like why don't we know? Like, well, how can we figure this out? And our research showed that at the end of the day, we came to a point where we discovered I can ask you one question about your students that will tell me with greater than 50% accuracy what's going to happen. Want to know what that question was?
Yes.
What's your reading level by age 8? What is your reading level by age 8? And the reason that was so important was because if you lived in a household or a community where you learned to read, that had huge benefits for how you participated in your family, your community, and your society. And it was an insulative factor. It insulated you from all of the other negative factors that beat you down that Reverend was referring to earlier. And if you could build that reading program, build that community that George was talking about, you could put them on a trajectory that kept them away from violence. And so, resilience. So that's the bias I bring to it. This is how important rehabilitation is.
I would like to make a comment and a question. First, the question is to the ACLU gentleman. Isn't the Constitutional Revisionist Committee committed to a felon voting rights act?
So I think the commission you're referring is the Constitution Revision Commission.
Yeah.
Although I happen to like Constitution Revisionist Commission better. They clearly would like to revisionist into something that's not something we would. The short answer is yes. They have a proposal in front of them. They've not yet endorsed it.
But if they endorse it, then you don't need the 775,000 signatures, right?
Well, yes, but the problem is the timelines are different. They don't have to make a decision until, their deadline isn't until May.
Right.
We have to basically be done by the end of this year. They're not going to complete their process by this year. Here's the other problem. They could change it in a way that we would disagree with, that the court has not approved, that would undercut the number of people who could come back into the system. They could carve out the number of crimes. They could make it like they would make exceptions for all people who had, misdemeanors of a certain level or any kind of violent crime whatsoever, and reduce the number of people who were re-enfranchised down to 100,000 or something
Okay.
like that.
Good answer.
And so we can't rely on what they might do, and frankly, nor should Florida citizens. You've already done the work to put this on the ballot. That commission shouldn't impede that work. the
Okay.
citizens have done.
Let me quickly make one other comment. It has to do with move to amend. And I think it's important, that George explained it very well, but I think there's one other thing that needs to be understood, is that to me, move to amend is the first step that has to be taken before other issues are really dealt with. Because if you don't deal with getting the money out of the politics, then you can't deal with all of the other issues. And the way I put it is in the form of a baseball diamond. You've got to get to first base first. And in order to get to first base, you have to take the money out of the politics. Once you get to first base, you can deal with social justice and economic justice. But you've got to solve the move to amend issue first.
You got one of it, Jamie. Money out of politics. Money isn't speech. No corporate constitutional rights. Because if you get money out of politics only, some groups, that's all they talk about. But if you still have corporate constitutional rights, they can still go in court, overturn your win.
I agree wholeheartedly. I skipped.
Back row in the way.
Just to follow up on the previous exchange, as a church volunteer, I recently had to help an African-American grandmother. Her grandson was involved in a criminal drug charge, and I was tasked to assist her with getting the ADA accommodations she needed to be in the courtroom. Well, I opened up the file. I am a lawyer with a small L. Obviously, I don't have a criminal justice background. And I saw immediately that the charge against him was wrong, and it wasn't the amount. And so I contacted the public defender immediately. Well, even as a church volunteer with a fax machine from the church, on stationery, under signature, took 3 weeks for a response. 3 weeks. And then when I went to the courthouse, there were scant documents involved in this young man's case. And I once she finally telephoned me, I said, I know you have a huge caseload, but you're not even at the minimum standard. And this has really got to change. Punchline, the case was mysteriously dismissed.
All right.
That's great, but how many times doesn't it happen?
Yeah.
Systemically,
And God bless that grandmother,
Oh, yeah,
okay?
yeah,
She reached out to the church.
that's right.
all right.
Go ahead. Resources are important.
The first thing we talked about was the Santa Clara versus Southern Pacific. I looked it up on the internet. It was 1886. And I have a question related to that. And as memory serves me, that decision, none of the writings of the judges had anything to do with making corporation people, but it was a clerk's mistake that put that in the heading. And that's what
And
they've
guess what?
always looked at.
That clerk was a former railroad executive.
That's right.
Right, and he was a judge, and he didn't do it by mistake.
Yeah.
Well, how do they base all these Supreme Court decisions on something one guy did that wasn't right?
Wasn't a judge.
There's a lot in this country that's based on something that's not right. You can, from day one, and I didn't cuss.
Now, we've had several
I want to go from a different angle, and that is, and I've been saying this to years, actually. The policemen, the police people, they need to be interviewed more carefully, and prejudice, they need to be sought out and not be given those jobs. The police are very significant in this prejudice, this whole prejudice thing, and how it all gets started, and how they pick the black people and so on.
Well, you
So
know, you
that
gotta-
prejudice is very important.
Prejudice is there.
Yes.
Racism is a thing.
Yeah.
But just as those of us who are anti-war and peace passionate people are not anti-military, right? I am not anti-police, because they're our neighbors.
Yeah.
They're our family.
Oh, I'm not.
Now, implicit bias is very real. And, you know, the reptilian brain, y'all know what I mean when I say the reptilian brain?
Yes.
So, deeply in our subconscious, if you are a white person, and if you are even a person of color who's on the police force, that narrative, that rhetoric about who's the criminal, who's the dangerous person, is so dominant in your brain that I have a nephew. I raised my nephew, or spent 10 years keeping him safe from 8 to 18. Now he's gone, that's cool. He's cool, he's out on his own. But we're large people, so when he was about 16 or 17, he and a friend got stopped. He got arrested for just being there, for just being in the car.
Yeah.
And the cop said, I was afraid of him, just because he's large and black.
Yeah.
Luckily he wasn't killed, but that's the reptilian brain. That's the inculcated racism that is in everybody, well, white people. I mean, people of color can be prejudiced, but racism is prejudice plus power. I don't have the power to get you fired or keep you from having a job or getting a loan, so my prejudice just stays there. But because of that racism that's so deeply embedded, a policeman might feel afraid and pick up their gun. That's the problem with their training. It's for them to deal with their implicit bias and come up with options, to not be able to talk through someone who has a mental illness and to go to your gun first instead of figuring out, how do I de-escalate this situation without violence? That's not brain surgery, y'all. We can learn that. And we have to build relationships with police officers, relationships with the military, because I told y'all earlier, the shit's gonna get harder before it gets better. I know there will be a day, well, saying no is a strong word, but I have envisioned, just as you envision your party on election night, and I don't really want this party to happen, but I envision being out in the streets with folks, and there are policemen there or military people there that we have to go up to and say, baby, you know you got to put that gun down, and you got to turn to the left, and you got to turn to the right, and you got to make them put the gun down. Because they're not gonna take the gun down because we say it. They're gonna take it down because they see and recognize in that crowd their mothers, their sisters, their brothers, and they won't kill us. And I want to make sure they don't kill us. So that's why I'm not going to demonize them. I'm going to hold them in love as I want to hold all humans in love and try to build relationships so that when push comes to shove, they know, we ain't doing this shit. You better put this gun down. So that's my response.
And I would say that apparently training can help combat that initial reaction. So one of the things that can be done at a local level is to call upon the local police departments and sheriffs to provide better training. And in the same token that you've got piecemeal human relations commissions around the state or human rights commissions, also to have police oversight committees of one variety or another. And that is something that can and is done at a local level. Back row?
Yeah, just as you talk about building our schools into community centers that are really involved with all aspects of the community, I feel if we could make our police agencies much more community oriented and of the community. It seems, from my perception, that there's a particular demographic of people who tend to become police officers. And I don't see an incentive for, I guess, younger people from all of the various communities to become a part of the police force. You know, if we were policing our own communities, like you say, if we saw our friends and our family in those communities that we were standing guard around, that us versus them, I think, would slowly fall away, and the culture that's built around our policing, I feel, would very much improve. And I wonder if there's any way that we could politically move forward to providing some scholarships that could be for people of certain communities, at least maybe disperse them a little more widely, draw people from communities that don't traditionally go into law enforcement to have an incentive to become an officer of the law and police their own communities. I don't know if there's any way that we could get together on a movement on that, but I feel like without incentivizing people, especially from those most occupied communities, you know.
It's a lot.
Newtown, for example.
It's a good idea for infiltration. Talk about infiltrating. Infiltrating the police force or infiltrating the military. But there is a culture already in place, and that culture is so hierarchical and so power over instead of power with that people would have to go in inoculated against some of those messages. Because those messages about who's the criminal, even us, if I said, picture a criminal, it'll be hard for y'all to picture somebody who's not black or brown. And that's because it's just so dominant in our subconscious. So if we did succeed in having black and brown folks join the military or the police force, we would have to try to inoculate them so that they go as a team, not one or two, but 3, 4, 6 at a time. Because you need a community to keep you strong.
And
I'd say the same thing if I was telling you to run for office.
Sarasota's police department does have some sort of scholarship program, and I'm not sure exactly whether it's only for or just intended to provide diversity, but I think the numbers of actual applicants have been very, very small. There are discussions about everybody treating everybody civilly and loving everybody even if they're wrong on an issue. And it is interesting that we have an ACLU representative and a move to amend, and the ACLU has some interesting positions on money is speech.
Oh, really? Do you?
You brought it up. I'm going to bat that one back to you.
Our position on Citizens United may not have been entirely satisfactory to most move to amend folks.
Well, but Grissom, that was our initial position.
Yeah. That was our position before we
have evolved. Let's just get it out there, all right?
Okay.
So when Citizens United first came out, and Grissom, you can help me understand the history of this, I don't think we challenged the decision that it was the wrong decision.
No.
But after much soul searching within the organization,
Yes.
we came around to oppose the decision in Citizens United. And so, I mean, it's been an evolution. But our position right now was that case was wrongly decided.
Right, and we are much more comfortable with the idea that corporate personhood is a misreading of the Constitution, but there are at least significant elements within the organization, can I phrase it that way, that still hold the line on speech, money is speech. So I know
So
that
Buckley
it's,
versus Vallejo, you guys think, oh yeah, that was a good decision?
well, I don't know, the organization versus significant elements within it, I'm gonna,
Okay.
so
No worries.
I'm not sure where we stand on that either. As he pointed out, there's been soul searching and internal wrangling. But I think it's a fine example of something where it is a core issue. And yet we've got significant players that have different views on it. And I mentioned earlier when I was about the move for single districts here, that when you start talking about how do you combat, because you've got words to describe needing to get enough minorities into a district, and then you've got the same thing where if you put too many people in and then you bleach the other districts, and so it can be very subtle, and different organizations of well-meaning people who are clearly on the progressive side of the ledger and writ large can have some very different views on the particular case. So you've got people that for a lifetime have been free speech absolutists that are clinging to free speech even in this situation. How do we keep that civil? How do we keep the fight so that we remember that not only are there folks that think money is speech, but they're planning to use it and use it the wrong way? How have you worked with partnerships and alliances where the overlap is not? Because if you're in battle, you want to be able to rely, you know, the idea of the foxhole, the man on the right, the woman on the left. Here we've got people that have different organizations that come with different focuses. So certainly, and I think I alluded earlier, talking about how do you get other people to take on, you know, a relatively small minorities group as their cause to get something passed, or how do we work with someone where you know that their leadership has been unreliable on a key issue? How coalition working? And
Then you do the work. You don't cede your power to someone to figure out what are the mechanics of democracy. We, the people, determine what that looks like on our neighborhoods, on our street. And yes, you might have a community that is all one demographic. I don't think that is necessarily horrible if you're practicing democracy there. If we do old school democracy, everybody go down to the AME Zion Church on Tuesday and we have a community forum about this issue, we're going to make decisions about how we're going to act on that. That may be a mechanism that works. I don't know. I know that there is something that called the People's Movement Assemblies, if you've ever heard of it. And you can Google Southern People's Movement Assembly Blueprint. If I could have gotten it and made a copy for everybody today, I would have brought it. It is fantastic. It's coming out of, there have been 7 Southern People Movement Assemblies, and that's states from Virginia down and over to Texas. And they've held 7 Southern People's Movement Assemblies, and in that, they've come up with a blueprint to create liberation. The theme is none of us are free until all of us are free. Fannie Lou Hamer. So they're using that message and they're looking at liberation. What does it take for us to get liberation when it comes to environment, school to prison pipeline, economics, and racial justice? And then how do we build power? And it is a great blueprint, and I think it's worth implementing as many places as we can. And that boils down to very basic, very local democracy. Getting together in a room and working it out, and then acting on what comes from that.
Can I just
Yeah,
say
you
one-
know-
oh, go ahead. No, please.
Well, I was just going to add it to your point. We do a great deal of advocacy training, which certainly relates to public policy and social justice training as well. And in doing this work, it all boils down to shared values. Because we train in looking at a visual of 3 concentric circles. There's us here, there's the haters over here, or the total opposition, that no matter what you do, you're not going to move them. And then there's that movable middle. And where we move the middle is finding that common ground and finding shared values that we all can agree on, at least to a point. And in doing this training, we find that, like, we look at the human rights ordinance that was recently passed in Jacksonville. It took us 10 years. We went door to door. We knocked on thousands of doors, having this exact same dialogue. How do we move this movable middle, and how do we find shared ground and shared values amongst everyone in reference to social justice and sexual orientation and, asking the right questions. What if you had a transgender, son or daughter, if you had a gay son or daughter, how would you want them, treated, things like that. So it certainly relates to politics as well in reference to moving this movable middle, and certainly in a divisive time that we're in right now. And it's difficult to find because I think that movable middle is shrunk to a great extent, and the two peripheries are certainly larger. So it takes a lot more education and a lot more skill in reference to the messaging that we do along those lines.
I just want to add one observation, if I could, is maybe from one of the organizations that isn't able to go over the barricades in the same way that other organizations are. I just want to lift up the comments that my colleagues made, because I think that's exactly right. The only thing I would add to it is that when I think about this coalition work a lot, I think about just the need to be transparent about what our limitations are. So the ACLU works in some specific channels. We litigate within an existing legal system that may or may not be about achieving the goals that George just laid out for you. But we're trying to bend it in that direction. So my limitation is there's only so much I can do in that space. But together, that's okay. She can do her part, I can do my part, we'll get to the top of the mountain together.
Sweet.
Can I just make a comment?
Quickly.
We are in a constitutional crisis as we speak right now. It's my opinion. And and I'm addressing the lawyers here in the room. There is such a manipulation of language and semantics in the laws that every side of an issue can be argued in a court of law. So what's happening is we're perpetuating your profession.
Okay.
That's at least a
That's interesting. It's very interesting.
I would remind the gentleman that Shakespeare, 400-something years ago said, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers.
Yeah, we ain't trying to kill no lawyers.
Those were the coup planners.
White supremacy, we want
Everybody
to kill that.
misinterprets that. The reason they wanted to kill the lawyers because the lawyers were the ones that were going to uphold the society and uphold the law.
The law.
Not because they were the bad guys.
Yes, the rights of English men, yes.
Although I will say that my law school dean, in my introductory lecture when I went to law school, came forth and said, quoting from Dante, that there is a special level of hell reserved for lawyers. So it's a fair comment. It's a fair
But
comment.
to be fair, we live
Something
in
to
that
look forward to.
all the
Yeah,
time.
you do.
So,
No, it will.
Thank you for your service.
I do have a comment. I agree
it's
that
like the gray.
I agree that we have a huge problem. First of all, we never were a democracy. But as a representative republic, we are terribly threatened. And this is where I think the move to amend and the other associating groups that work with them are right. We have it's like we have a broken down vehicle, but we have to fix the vehicle. But that doesn't negate the fact that we can't do something. There are microaggressions, but there are micro-progressions. And I think the story that you told about your dad, about the Spanish lady and how he came forward for her, and at the same time he was able to address the woman that was rude without denigrating and without shaming her, but she got the message. We are all in the same choir here. We have to be proselytizers. And I think communication is the big thing. You don't go and talk to a whole group. You talk to your neighbor. And we reach out to people, what you were talking about, the group that goes together. There may be someone in the Tea Party who you politically disagree on everything, but you're both worried about the environment. So we need to find, and I think this is what this whole conference is about, is finding common ground with people with whom you do not agree in general. And I think it's kind of like being in church. Go forth and proselytize. And,
I wouldn't go for the people who are less like you first.
No.
In some ways that
But you know what I'm saying.
we've heard at Move to Amend, we hear from our affiliates. And if you haven't signed the Move to Amend petition, please do. movetoamend.org. We need 500,000 signatures. We've close. We've got 440 something. But we want to get 500,000 by the end of the year. So sign the petition and let people know who haven't signed it yet. But we sometimes hear, and early on we heard regularly from our affiliates about reaching out to Republicans and libertarians and whatnot. Absolutely. And we also early on had our movement education program, which is required. The movement education program is anti-oppression light plus movement building. So it's some skills and information about oppression and how it works, but a lot about past movements and how they work. And as Nina said last night, no movement has started with a hell of a lot of people. Right. Most movements that won in this country were started by small groups of consistent people who were persistent and kept at it for a long time. Suffrage took over 70 years, y'all. That is, it just is infuriating that it took that long for women to get the right to vote. But we know that we can get the 28th Amendment, but we need numbers. So we need the proselytizing, but with what I would describe as, it's not really low-hanging fruit, because approaching an undocumented community or an African American or a Muslim community isn't necessarily an easy lift for folks in this room. But those are the folks who are experiencing the consequences of corporate rule. So that's what makes them the folks that you approach first, and build relationships with those folks, build your numbers, get more volunteers, get more leaders, transfer skills, transfer power, and build. Then it's a good time to approach your Republicans, your Libertarians, even though they might look more like you, and that makes it easier to approach them because you can talk about something in common right off the gate. When you step to somebody who Spanish is their second language and their family's not documented, they're worried about DACA, it may be hard to start the conversation. But that's the first place I recommend starting.
All right, I think,
Could I just say one thing, and sort of in closing? I know it's closing. I just want to urge
Got
people.
to get this young woman before we close.
I'm sorry.
Lady back.
No, you go ahead.
She's had her hand up before.
if you're going to close, last question,
Okay.
then close.
Okay.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I really appreciate your words, George, especially because you're tying, all of these issues can seem so separate at times. The school development pipeline, unequal policing of communities of color, and corporations having, a lot of influence in our judicial system, but they're all really so tied together. So I'm a teacher and I'm a social worker. And a lot of these issues, I see them coming together all of the time, and it really comes down to us being able to question our institutions and what they stand for, who they stand for, and what their goals are. So just to give a short example, one of my students got into a fight at school and she was suspended for 10 days. Not only was she suspended for 10 days, but as I'm talking to her and I'm asking her, how is she going to make up her work, she tells me she is not allowed on campus to get her homework. For the 2 weeks of school, she's not allowed to be there, or else she's going to face expulsion. So does that sound like an institution that's trying to educate kids? Or does that sound like an institution that's trying to teach a young black girl her place in society?
Right?
Right? And again, with policing, police are supposed to keep us safe.
Tell us what school it is so we can boycott it.
I'll tell you later.
Not on camera.
You can't tell them?
I will tell you later. But in addition, our policing systems are policing that are disproportionately targeting communities of color, stopping black men while driving for not, being a threat to society, women who face sexual assault who are never given justice, rape kits who frequently go untested. Does that sound like an institution who's trying to keep us safe, or an institution who's trying to keep us in our place? So we cannot underestimate our ability to go into these schools, to write op-eds in the paper, and to hold our local institutions' feet to the fire. And it is so important not to underestimate our own ability and our own power to do so. So thank you, everyone. Just by showing up today, you are just doing the work. You're starting to do the work, and I'm so excited. Even though all this crazy bad stuff is going on, I'm just really fortunate to be in this room with you all. So thank you.
I've got a litmus test for y'all when it comes to the school. Getting the cops out is huge and takes a lot of work. There's a group in LA called the Chuco Justice Center, and the young people there have asked that the LA police set aside 1% of their budget for youth programs. And it would be like $10-15 million, 1% of their budget. I recommend that y'all think about that there, because if they care about young people, 1% of the budget set aside for youth programs, how hard is that? And if they're not willing to do it, you better shut up saying you care about young people.
Yep.
That's the litmus test. So.
There you go.
And now, to close things up, our room host, Carol.
Okay, I just wanted to say, we talked a lot about visions today, and if you'd like to continue the conversation, tomorrow afternoon from 1 to 4 at Fogartyville, we're having a very in-depth conversation on new models of how to bring about a lot of what we talked about today. So I urge everyone to come. So 1 to 4 at Fogartyville, and thank you for everyone for participating in this. I think it was a really wonderful conversation. Somehow I'm going to have to summarize this. Taking notes like 50 pages. So I got to work on making a summary of this. But it was great.
Fighting for Justice takes place next year. You have a few minutes break if you want to get a drink, use the bathroom, whatever. The Economics of Sprawl will be in room 113, or Wealth and Income Inequality in the main cafeteria. Those are your three choices for next break.